Joining us now, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Democratic nominee for New York's 14th district. She stunned the Democratic establishment Tuesday night, unseating a 10-term incumbent congressman. Also, Cori Bush is with us, hoping to pull off a similar feat against another longtime Democratic incumbent in Missouri's 1st district. Welcome to both of you. Great explanation, by the way.
Thank you. I'm dying to go first on this. That explanation makes sense to a lot of people.
Yes.
But a lot of people who watch that are already in your camp. Being tied to the word socialist, are you concerned that when you get on the big stage, that could be a killer for you? There are a lot of people in the middle that aren't going to go through that explainer. And when they hear socialist, they think, my hard-earned dollars, I'm not ready to give them away.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a perfectly legitimate concern. I always go back to how we won this race. And we don't win this race with labels. We don't win this race with saying, I am this or I am that. We always ran this race with our goals and our issues in mind. We ran this race talking about Medicare for all. We won this race talking about, opening tuition-free public colleges and universities, expanding our educational opportunities, our transit, our banking. We talk directly to the explanation that you were talking about, not explaining what these ideologies are. People don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm a capitalist, or I'm a this, or I'm a that.
They don't think about ideology.
No, we don't think about ideology. We think about what we're trying to get done. And I think that a lot of times people make these ideologies, they try to make that the conversation point with the intent of being divisive, with the intent of being alienating. But at the end of the day, what I found in our district was that most people want to make sure that everyone has health care. Most people want to make sure that every child has access to an equitable education through college. And that's really what we're talking about.
Cori, all campaigns are unique. The issues you face are going to be unique. But are there things that you saw in Alexandria's campaign that you're hoping to utilize?
Absolutely. So Alexandria's campaign was powerful. The momentum was there. It was electric. And that's what's happening on the ground here in St. Louis. We have people power. We may not have the money, but we have people showing up. We have people saying that this is who I want. It's about leadership. It's not about loyalty. It's not about the power. It's about who is going to best represent and fight for working families. And even those that may not be considered under that term, people who are on disability, chronic persistent mental illness, they still should have a voice at the table. And so that's what I'm looking at with her race, and that's the same thing that's happening with ours.
Let's talk about impactful leadership, because I can't find anybody out there who says, I'm inspired by Mitch McConnell. I'm dying to spend time with him. Your video was amazing. You have inspired people. But Mitch McConnell is a tactical beast. People aren't sending him Christmas cards, but they're sending him campaign donations. He is leading the charge to get another Supreme Court justice in position. When you look at the success the Republican Party has playing legit life-or-death hardball, what do you take from that, and what are you going to do?
Well, once again, I think kind of going back to our initial message in this campaign and in that video, it's people versus money. We're not going to beat them at that big money game. That's a trap. We need to beat them with big organizing. They need to know that, I just want a race where I was outspent 10-1. I have shown that big organizing is possible. I believe that big organizing is the future of the Democratic Party. I believe that we will make them lose these seats because we've got the votes.
But do Democrats know how to unify and get it done? Because conservatives have shown this year that they do.
Yeah. Well, I think that I can. I think that candidates like Cori Bush can. I think that when you have electric candidates that don't take corporate lobbyist funds so that their communities trust them to advocate directly for their needs, I think this is really the future. You have electric candidates like Cori Bush, electric candidates like Ayanna Pressley that unify people, excite the electorate, and really what the Democratic base is non-voters. I knew that going into this. I knew that my base were people who don't usually turn out in office.
Yeah, although that's also got Donald Trump elected. A whole bunch of people who felt. So it's an interesting point, but it does everybody's going to be looking for non-voters in a way that we don't traditionally do in a campaign. Cori, you and Alexandria are part of Justice Democrats with a wide-ranging platform. There are some positions like ensuring a livable wage tied to inflation. it's going to find resistance from some people. When we talk about minimum wages, we talk about these things. We have a lot of people who come out here, particularly Republicans, who say there's a market that dictates wages. There's a market that dictates health care. We have argued many, many times that a market-oriented health care is a bit perverse. It's like market-oriented prisons, right? We don't actually want more demand for them. But how do you get these ideas into that non-voter crowd when you actually face built-in resistance?
So one thing about it is people that make $7, $8 an hour, they don't work less hard than people who make $30 an hour. And so making sure that people have what they need to be able to support their families, pay their bills, and still have money left over to save should not be something we should have to beg for. We have companies that we know of that move to $15 an hour minimum wage, $15 an hour wage, and they're prospering, they're doing well. And when I think about it, so we can come up with money to be able to build these tent cities and pay $800 a day per child to be able to house thousands of children. We can come up with the money to do that, millions of dollars a day to have people in these detention centers, but we can't make sure that people that are working hard every single day are able to take care of their families. I think that we can do better.
This is a brilliant point. And what can you learn as a candidate from Donald Trump's strategy? Because I look at Donald Trump's base, who is wildly loyal to him. And exactly to that point of the tent cities, Donald Trump is playing to his base emotionally that feel left out and forgotten. But if we spent the tens of millions of dollars we're spending on these tent cities and brought them to rural America or inner cities and got faster Wi-Fi or better healthcare or better schools, that would energize that non-voting base that got out there and didn't just vote for him. They're wildly loyal to him.
Yeah, you know, and I think that kind of speaks directly to the question when people say, oh, these ideas, who in Congress is going to resonate with these ideas? Well, for me, it's about which of the American people are going to resonate with these ideas. And what we find is that I believe that the American electorate, us as voters, us as a nation, are ready for a very bold agenda. And when we try to kind of water down that agenda because of fear of what people may think or et cetera, what we find is that we don't really have a message. And we cannot run without a message. You know, Donald Trump ran with a message. It was disturbing. It was divisive. It was based in fear.
Clear.
But it was very clear.
Yeah.
Exactly right. And so I think that
fearless.
And
to
yeah.
your point.
And so I think that for what we need to do is this is a time more than ever to be bold, to be clear, to say we are a party of social, economic, and racial justice for working class Americans, and that's what we're going to accomplish together.
Well, that's clear.
Corey, last
That's a
point.
clear message.
We need to have fighters. We should have champions, people that are willing to lead the issues. It's not okay anymore to vote decent. You have to stand up and fight, because what's happening with this administration, what's happening in the White House, they're taking people out. And so right now we need people that are bold. That's what a leader is. You're bold. You're moving with new ideas, and you're not afraid to stand up for the people that you're supposed to serve.
Not okay anymore to vote decent. What a great way to end that. Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.